Good evening, everybody. My name is Father Stephen, and I'm on the committee of the AECA and also editor of Koinonia. As I mentioned before I hand over to Father William, our chairman, to officially welcome our lecturer this evening, you will notice that I have put all of you on mute as you arrive. That will allow us to hear Father Dragos clearly when he starts in a few moments' time. You may wish to put your Zoom screen on speaker view, then you will see the person who's speaking largest on screen at the time. So first of all, this evening, we will, after the welcome, hear Father Dragos's lecture under the title that he's given us. And then there will be a time for questions afterwards, and that section will be chaired by Dimitri Salapatas. I think that's probably all I need to say for the moment. If you have any particular comments as we go on, just direct them to me in the chat function. I'll continue to admit people as they arrive, but for the moment I'll hand over to Father William Taylor, Chair of the Anglican Eastern Churches Association.
Thank you, Father Stephen. It's wonderful to welcome so many people here this evening for the 2020 Constantinople, particularly our lecturer, Father Dragos Herescu, the principal of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge. This year, of course, like everyone else, we're having to do things by Zoom, which is both marvelous and not marvelous. It's marvelous in the sense that it brings people in some virtual proximity. Last night, I joined a lecture in Bishkek on the Syriac monastic spirituality in that part of Central Asia. And that's a wonderful thing to be able to join those kind of events. But of course, we miss each other in the flesh, and we look forward to a time when we can meet again in the flesh in our incarnational way. We have an extremely important subject right now across the whole of Europe in the advance of secularism, which Father Dragos will address from his Romanian Orthodox perspective. Father Dragos Herescu is the principal of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge, and the Institute was founded more than 20 years ago as a pan-Orthodox place of education, research, and outreach. Continuing in that spirit, the IOX, as it's now called, now offers online courses in Orthodox Christian Studies, as well as degree programs at master and doctoral level. These are complemented by outreach public events that address relevant topics for Orthodox Christians and more, such as this evening. Father Dragos teaches for the Institute and the Cambridge Theological Federation at undergraduate and postgraduate level in the areas of Christian spirituality and secularization. He is an affiliated lecturer of the Divinity Faculty in the University of Cambridge and a board member of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. He also serves on the board of the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative, an ecumenical organization composed of Orthodox and evangelical Christians committed to sponsoring joint mission projects. Father Dragos serves as parish priest for the Romanian Orthodox parish of St. John the Evangelist in Cambridge. He's currently getting used to the blessing of being the father of an energetic toddler, learning to welcome the unexpected with joy. Father Dragos, you are most welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the welcome and for the introduction, William. Because we're pressed sort of by time, I'll start by saying straight away that It is an honor to have been asked to deliver this year's Constantinople Lecture by the Anglican and Eastern Churches Association, which is truly a venerable organization, having been a pioneer of ecumenical life sharing between the Anglican and the Orthodox churches all the way to the mid-19th century. Now, the three words that make up the title of this talk warrant a separate lecture of their own: Secularism, Orthodoxy, and Europe. So in preparing for this evening, I asked myself, what would be the word, what would be the idea that can tie them together in a way that makes this paper, this talk, deliverable in 30 to 40, 45 minutes? So it seems to me that that word is relevance, because it just sits beneath the surface of what is at stake in relation to religion today in Europe, including the Orthodox Church or Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Another observation that I need to make from the start is that no talk about religion in society today, with its unavoidable secular backdrop, can be done in the kind of regional insulation that was possible even 30 years ago, when communism and the Iron Curtain were still around. Today, globalization, migration, new opportunities for work and travel, and the internet itself have made the religious context much more connected, much more interdependent, and have turned what was once predominantly, or what were once predominantly monochromatic religious spaces into a growing tapestry of faiths and religious traditions inhabiting the same space. For example, data from the Pew Research Center, and I will quote information and data from them throughout at least the first part of what I'm trying to say here. So data from the Pew Research Center in the area of religion and public life projected in the interval 2010-2050, the makeup of Europe's religious tapestry is likely to change in a significant way, with Europe's Christian population expected to drop by about 100 million people, falling from 553 million in 2010 to a projected 454 million in 2050. And this, across sort of all kind of religious faiths, will be joined by a slight decline in the Jewish population. But it, at the same time, there is a projected increase in the Muslim population by a staggering 63% by their estimation, from 43 million in 2010 to around 71 million in 2050. Also in the number of religiously unaffiliated people, they foresee a growth of about 16%, from 140 million in 2010 to 162 million in 2050. And also a moderate rise in the number of Hindu and Buddhists. More focusedly, data over the 2010-2020 decade indicate that religious affiliation in Europe dropped from 74.5% of the population to 72% for Christians, whereas it grew from 5.9 to 6.8 for Muslims, and from around 18.8% to 20% for those declaring no religious affiliation. It's a lot of numbers, but numbers are relevant when we talk about religion in society today, I think. They give us a pinning point. But in simpler numeric terms, by 2050, the Christian population is projected in Europe to have a steady negative 0.5 annual growth. The unaffiliated population, religious unaffiliated population, an annual growth, a steady annual growth of 0.4%, and the Muslim population a 1.2 compound annual growth. Now, I will not venture further down the rabbit hole of statistical analysis, but it will suffice to say that what these numbers paint in relation to religion in society is both a picture of increased relevance and irrelevance. Christianity seems to face a continued crisis of relevance manifested in declining numbers. So, when tackling the issues of religious belief and practice vis-a-vis secularism or secularization, orthodoxy, and Europe, relevance seems to be a useful lens. Now, in what sense? Well, secularism or secularization have at their very core the question of the continued relevance of religion in modern and postmodern society. Orthodoxy is witnessing the exacerbation of a process of hermeneutical dissonance between its theology and its practice, which is the gateway towards hermeneutical irrelevance. And this process is now, I think, affecting its institutional structures, post-Crete and post-Ukraine. But while the context of the Orthodox diaspora communities in Western Europe is quite different than the context in Eastern Europe, since I believe in the West, parish communities are both more fluid and transitory, and also made up of a younger demographic, but also I think more committedly practicing. In Eastern Europe, one notices much more of a polarized debate around issues of religion, especially in its institutional and traditional forms, on the backdrop of an aging or aged practicing membership. I could throw in a couple of examples. In Romania, for example, one can very easily read about the debates around the erection of the new national cathedral in Bucharest, the failed constitutional referendum in 2018 on the definition of the family, which was heavily supported by the Orthodox Church, by all major churches in Romania, basically. Also in Serbia is another example. There's this kind of new but deep running controversy regarding freedom of speech between the Patriarchate and the Faculty of Theology in Belgrade. But as concerns Europe, in terms of the relevance, as the statistical data indicates, the issues at hand are those of diversity, pluralism, and tolerance, which all are tethered to the question of the relevance of religion in the public space. Beside these more sociologically based concerns, the question of relevance is also a theological question. For me, it comes up in relation to the last words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. I'm not a New Testament scholar, but these are probably his last words on earth until his second coming, when he says to the apostles, "I am with you always until the end of the age," in Matthew 28:20. So the theological question, one of them for us today as Christians, is how do we make this, his continual presence, known today? One has to recall that this promise of Christ cannot be separated by the context in which it was made, one of discipleship, baptism, and teaching, that is to say, context of witness. I wonder whether our condition today of fragmented and sometimes diverging witness as Christians make it harder for Christ to be with us. It certainly makes him less visible, less relevant. So the question remains, how do we go about, in a secular context, discovering Christ's continual presence in our own time and place? This is both an external challenge towards the world and internal towards and within the church. Internally, it has an ecumenical dimension as well as a confessional dimension, which is specific to each Christian tradition. Now, I aim to further unpack some of these issues in the course of this talk, and in doing so, it is important to clarify what this paper will do and will not do going forward. What this talk will not do, is entertain arguments regarding the virtues or pitfalls of secularism, but it will consider some of the ways in which secularization impacts orthodoxy in both Western and Eastern Europe, with the associated secularism it nurtures. Similarly, what this paper will not endorse is a complaintive approach towards the West, towards Western civilization or culture and so on, or a triumphalist orthodoxy. Rather, it will advocate for an increased shared ownership of our ecumenical consciousness on the backdrop of secularization and increased secularism in Europe. This does not mean the creation of a mix and match syncretic Christianity, where we borrow elements or developments from other Christian churches. Although, having come to know more closely the Anglican Church here in the UK, there are a few things that one would hope might translate to the Orthodox, for example, as hard to believe for our Anglican friends that might sound. Rather, what I mean is the cultivation of a keener reciprocal sensitivity to developments in our respective traditions, which could or would inform developments in our own. To that effect, in the last part of this talk, I will venture to consider some of the directions which the Orthodox could rediscover and rethink in our own practice. Now, secularism and secularization. We have to spend a couple of minutes looking at these terms and what they mean. Although they are akin, secularism and secularization, in the sense that they challenge both the relevance of religion, or more precisely, the relevance of Christian religious life and witness in society, they have their own ecologies. Both challenge the relevance of religion at three levels: in the wider societal plane, what we tend to call religion in society; in the ecclesial institutional makeup, who we are as church in the world; and in the life of individuals, what people believe and practice. Theologically, both are part of the process by which man or humanity seeks to assert its relevance autonomously, either independently or in opposition or in rejection of God. In that sense, one might say that secularization has been happening since the fall. Paraphrasing the British sociologist and theologian David Martin, the process of secularization is concerned with the autonomous study of man in society. I take secularism to refer to an attitude vis-a-vis religion in the public sphere. At its best, it is expressed and applied as part of a political or ideological framework which aims to ensure a level playing field for religious organizations and religious practice in society, a kind of normative commitment to neutrality on the part of the state towards religious affairs, which includes a form of separation of church and state, while aiming to ensure, or at least postulate, the freedom of religion, conscience, and thought. In practice, secularism occupies a very fragile ground. It is constantly at the intersection of religion, freedom, multiculturalism or pluralism, and politics, which means that it is easily and carelessly misused or misinterpreted. It often becomes a byword for secular humanism or atheism. And that is why, for Christians, it carries echoes of persecution, marginalization, the loss of political influence, and the implicit, if not often explicit, relegation of religion as a private matter. This is one of the main points where secularism and secularization intersect and are often confused. I think that because the lingering mindset of the Byzantine symphonic model continues to represent the de facto blueprint of state-church relations for the Orthodox, although there is sufficient evidence that it was never the blueprint, but rather a very contextual arrangement of the post-Constantinian era. In the historically Orthodox countries, secularism, understood as the separation of church and state and as the relegation of religion to the private sphere, is seen as profoundly unnatural by the church. Every time political or civil society action pushes to diminish the fluid bartering middle ground between state and church, this is counteracted by favorable arguments rooted in history, tradition, and religious heritage. In practice, it seems to me, in the east of Europe, secularism operates as a seesaw, with the state, or politicians to be more precisely, and the church, or the church leadership to be more precise, at each end. Until the seesaw model is done away with altogether, neither will disrupt the motion. Moreover, what is equally essential in this dynamic is that the center of balance remains the same and in the middle of the board, so they can reach eventually a balance. This common center of balance is made up of several coexisting and overlapping narratives: ethno-religiosity, ethno-nationalism with periodic spikes and variable intensities, a positive interplay between state building and religion, skepticism towards external alien influence, whether that is cultural, political, or religious, all toned down by an overachieving underdog mindset. I recognize a lot of this from me growing up in Romania and just being a young man in that context. Both church and state in the Orthodox countries of Eastern Europe will access this reservoir of master narratives as they negotiate their own mutual relationship, but also their separate identities. for the Orthodox Church, the context of societal secularization brought about by the collapse of communism from the early 90s onwards has been a catalyst for revisiting these narratives time and again, and has constantly informed the public discourse and national psyche in, I suppose, all the countries of Eastern Europe. Secularization, as the sort of the other term, refers to the socio-religious analytical framework, and indeed the process itself, which maps or aims to map the decline of the relevance of religious institutions, beliefs, and practices in modern society. And researchers such as the British sociologist of religion Steve Bruce, for example, map this change, understood as decline, all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, while others will consider the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent urbanization, certainly in the UK, as a starting or at least a pivotal point in the way the religious makeup of the West at first, or Western society, began to experience a decline in religious observance, unity, and eventually relevance. The argument in a nutshell is that sometime over the last 500 years, a profound change occurred in human society that altered the religious makeup of European society, a point beyond which we cannot go back. Secularization is here to stay. That's kind of one of the arguments. And despite the occasional flash flood of religious revival, we are looking at a somewhat inevitable process of religious desertification. Certainly in Europe, or in the parts of the world which emulate the Western pattern of social democracy, pluralism, and free market economy. Without going into overbearing details about the scholarly debate regarding the process of secularization itself or the operating terms of the paradigm, I should still say that there are voices such as those of Grace Davie, which is another British sociologist of religion, whom you might have heard of. She was the one that coined the believing without belonging phrase. Also, the late American sociologist Peter Berger, and indeed the aforementioned David Martin, who proposed a less pessimistic look or outlook for religion in society. Their argument focuses on religious change rather than decline, on postulating that societal secularization does not necessarily condition the secularization of consciousness of individuals, or on the revival of interest in the supernatural or the spiritual, to which some add as well the very public reassertion of religious issues that occurred in the late 20th century, either because of migration or politics, and the greater interconnectivity of the world. Indeed, scholars of this persuasion will point out that religious decline is a case of Western European exceptionalism, in stark contrast to developments in South America, Africa, India, or even in the States. Eastern Europe and the Christian Orthodox context also feature examples which tend to sort of buck the Western secularization trend. And if this was not enough, to further complicate the picture, there are voices, researchers, who argue the case for a bespoke secularization paradigm in Eastern Europe and Greece, affecting the Orthodox Church. I have to say that the Russian context is specific enough to not be easily assimilated into a generic Eastern European Orthodox pattern, although there are points of overlap. I myself subscribe to this last emerging paradigm or perspective. I think secularization in the Eastern Orthodox space seems to me to be defined by the confluence of a mutated strand of Western European secularization on the one hand, which includes social differentiation, pluralism of cultural and religious ideas, joined by increased socioeconomic mobility, supported by a growing sense of belonging to a European rather than just a local Eastern European identity. And on the other hand, by an increased defensive, conservative, and nationalistic reaction by the Orthodox Church, partly as a response to the changes brought about by the former, and partly as an internal hermeneutic deficiency in communicating the faith outside of its base demographic, which scarcely includes the younger post 89-90 generation. There are both statistical data and just kind of anecdotal evidence to support the fact that the Orthodox Church, although it's trying really hard in a sense in Eastern Europe, is not really making the inroads that it should in connecting with kind of this generation in their late 30s, early 40s, which is really kind of the generation after the fall of communism. Churches tend to be full, as the cliche goes, but it continues to predominate kind of a demographic of people who are not in that I don't know 20 to 50 bracket. And since we're talking about demographics, let me say something about that as well, about Orthodox demographics in terms of religious affiliation and practice. Again, data from this ever reliable Pew Research Center indicates that out of the 260 million Orthodox Christians worldwide, approximately 200 million, or 76%, live in Central and Eastern Europe, with Russia accounting for over 100 million of that number. The largest Orthodox populations in Europe outside Russia are in Ukraine with around 35 million, Romania with almost 90 million, Greece with almost 10 million. And when these numbers are scrutinized further, they paint a less monolithic picture. The Orthodox in Eastern Europe and are far less orthopraxical than their declared religious affiliation would suggest. While belief in God ranks high at around 91%, only around 10% attend church at least weekly. In a sense, the paradigm of believing without belonging, or its variant, believing in belonging, coined by Grace David, whom I mentioned, to explain the shifting religious affiliation and declining numbers in Western Europe, seems to apply in Eastern Europe as well. This is mirrored by the situation in Western Europe, where a 2017 survey of 15 countries showed that Christian identity is claimed by the majority of the population, around 70%, although only around 22% would attend services monthly or more. In the UK, for example, the numbers were 18% for church-attending Christians, 55% for non-practicing Christians, and 23% for the religiously unaffiliated. So out of all of this, church-attending Christians are scored the lowest numbers. Now, as regards numbers for the Orthodox diaspora in Western Europe, well, these numbers are even less reliable or more put into question, as there are constant variation owing to circular migration and high mobility. For example, in Germany, numbers of Orthodox were around the 1 million mark in 2010, whereas now estimates place them at around 2 million. Equally, in the UK, numbers were estimated around 460,000 in 2013 and estimated to go over 500,000 in 2020. And as I say, these numbers, we should take them with a pinch of salt, simply because, by contrast, the Office for National Statistics here in the UK was estimating the numbers of Romanians in the UK to be 427 in 2019. And I suppose a large number of those would also be practicing, as I said. So what do these numbers indicate in relation to Orthodoxy? For Eastern Europe, the low attendance numbers may point to a crisis of relevance that is coming, and to the establishment of, or the reassessment or the reaffirmment of civil religion, where ethno-religious identity is assumed as part of the cultural and historic fabric, but not reinforced by an affiliation lived in practice. They also point towards what may prove to be an important demographic difference in the secular dynamic between the Orthodox and the other Christian traditions, especially the Protestant, in that both in the 20th century, and now in the first quarter of the 21st, the majority of Orthodox Christians continue to live, work, and be mobile, and at the same time practice their faith, albeit to varying degrees, in Europe. Whereas for the Protestant and to some extent for the Roman Catholic context, there's been a shift sort of towards the south, but this has not occurred for the Orthodox. So there is Europe is still kind of the place where it all happens for the Orthodox. Although there are significant developments in Africa, in Ethiopia, but the picture there is again quite complex. Now, I want to address now how secularization impacts Orthodoxy in both Western and Eastern Europe, if I could stretch to that. I think this geographical concentration in Europe may lead to a greater intra-European cross-pollination, both between the different Orthodox nationalities, to put it this way, and between diaspora and home communities within the same National Orthodox Church. What I mean by that is, if one thinks simply of the UK or of Cambridge or of London, you will meet Russian or Greek Orthodox Christians and Romanian Orthodox Christians in the same place. There will be parishes that are sometimes in the immediate vicinity. There is much more chance of meeting, of cooperating, of being aware of one another abroad, as it were, than it is from people living in Eastern Europe in their own countries. There's much more of an openness. So this idea about cross-pollination. And I think, as I said, there's anecdotal evidence that this is already happening. One effect of this may be an internal refresh occurs, which may delay or counteract the effects of secularization. There is certainly a new development in European Orthodoxy, which is partly connected to the refresh I mentioned, and possibly connected also to the resistance to the effects of secularization. This new development, I think, is the experience of Orthodoxy as a diaspora minority faith or minority religion. It's made up of mobile young communities, as it were, made up of aliens and sojourners. Although pockets of Orthodox communities or parishes have always existed in the West and in the Far East, one only has to mention the name of St. John of Shanghai, or later San Francisco, or of St. Innocent of Alaska in this sense. But these communities never reached the critical mass that Orthodoxy has reached in Western Europe and beyond, to a degree, after 1990. When millions of Romanians and Bulgarians, joined by smaller but consistent numbers of Greeks and Russians, ventured and later settled in Western Europe in a different way than in any other time in history. The communities of St. John and St. Innocent's time were also literally oceans apart from their home roots. In Europe, one is at most a 4-hour flight back to Russia or Greece or Romania, either to go back for the major holidays or to join a family anniversary and so on. Also, communication on social media has transformed the way faith communities are connected and aware of one another. So I believe the experience of being a minority faith or minority religion for the Orthodox, of having to travel, for example, by car for anything between 20 to 40 minutes, sometimes more, to get to church on a Sunday, and equally of having your parish priest travel the same distance to come to you for a house blessing or to visit a sick relative. All of this, I think, are parts of the elements that could contribute to this revival of Orthodox identity happening geographically in the West. I think this is certainly the case in the UK. It all goes back to the question of relevance. I myself have spoken with countless people in the parish, And I know that these kind of interactions and experiences are hard to capture in a kind of a research context that seeks hard numbers and evidence. But countless people have said to me that after not being much of a church goer in Romania, for example, they have started going to church here in the UK. For some, it is a story not unlike that of the prodigal son, who after taking a break from his old-fashioned father, eventually realizes what is important, what is relevant, and gives it another go, returns. For others, it is a sense of longing and community that makes them seek the church, in a sense. For others, or to try to reconnect with their faith, with their religious identity. And for others, it is the occasion of a baptism, where the priest that they initially resented for asking them to prepare by reading a gospel passage or by learning or relearning the creed and by considering to offer confession, turns out to be someone who does not need or want their money or anything else out of them except their time or a little bit of time. Knowing the context of Eastern Europe, for example, a lot of people are surprised that all you want as a priest from them is a bit of time, which even that is hard to get. Another change of the minority diaspora context for the Orthodox has been that most priests are ineffective volunteers. They generally do not get paid by the parish or the church, or maybe just a small sort of amount, but they tend to have a secular job like their parishioners. They understand what it means to not have time for church, but also the need to discover and hold on to a sense of being and identity that transcends the worth offered by your job or by the secular world. Another change, it seems to me, is that at the level happening at the level of parish identity for the Orthodox in the West. It took me coming to the UK, to Cambridge, to realize that growing up in Romania and going to church from quite a young age, I never really developed a sense of a parish identity. I never felt I was the member of a parish. For a complexity of reasons, as I said, I never felt like I belonged to a parish in which, for example, the parish in which our block of flats was located. The first time I felt that I belonged to a parish was in Cambridge, with people who were complete strangers to me only a few months ago or before, and people who were not even Romanian, because the parish wasn't even a Romanian parish, but rather the English-speaking Russian Orthodox parish in Cambridge, which is still ministered to by Father Raphael. I hope I'm not overreaching when I say that I recognize some of that parish spirit in the parish where I now minister as priest. But I think to have people, and not only sort of Romanians, whom you see almost every Sunday, knowing that they had traveled 20 or 30 minutes or 30 miles to be there, or indeed that although not ethnically Romanian, they join in and help make the parish diverse, as it should be, I think, is I believe, a testimony to that parish identity that people either have developed or they get a sense of. Now, I would be remiss to omit saying something about the impact of this pandemic that we're still in the middle of on church life. When I read in September of this year, some of you might have also read this, in the Catholic Herald, that the Luxembourg Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich saying that the number of Catholics going to church would decrease as a result of COVID-19, and that, as the headline read in the paper, and I quote, "The pandemic may have accelerated the secularization of Europe by 10 years." I have to say I was conflicted. Part of me was inclined to agree with the Cardinal's estimation, although he indicated that it was a qualified assertion primarily for Luxembourg. But another part of me was quite baffled by this. Yes, the Cardinal was making a reasonable point that once people have seen that life is very comfortable and that they can live very well without having to come to church, as he put it, they will not do so after the pandemic ends. Those who came for cultural reasons will cease coming altogether. However, my experience, and indeed that of other Orthodox priests, as well as Anglican or Methodist or United Reformed clergy that I spoke with during this period, was that virtual attendance at services during lockdown was much increased from what it was before. That people were joining in, despite the eventual Zoom fatigue, for talks, community events, support groups or prayer groups, with a newly discovered enthusiasm. Not quite a revival, but certainly not the church's last gasp. Moreover, once we were allowed to resume services in church with limited numbers, and I can only speak from the experience of my parish here, but I think this is probably replicated in other contexts, in both other Orthodox parishes and other and parishes of belonging to the Anglican or Methodist and so on churches. I was astonished to see that it often took me longer to set up the online booking process for the 30 places available in church for the Sunday liturgy that it took for those places to be booked up. So, suspecting some system error or even foul play, I won't be able to walk this back, but I did this. I once watched in real time how all 30 places were booked in less than 10 minutes. I found myself having to counsel parishioners on several occasions who were frustrated that they didn't manage to get a place, often for the second week in a row. And I had to check that it was not the same people booking every Sunday and abusing the system, and it wasn't. So I could not see any of the projection that, for example, Cardinal Hollerich was making. And I'm sure that in the aftermath of this pandemic, sociologists of religion and theologians will have decades of research material to consider the effects it has had on churches, on religion in the public and private sphere. I'm intrigued to see whether the Cardinal's assessment applies to Eastern Europe as well, whether the pandemic and the restriction on worship that followed have in effect introduced a distancing, an estrangement of the faithful from active participation and from their religious or faith identity, or whether it hasn't. Will it be a case of absence makes the heart grow fonder, or rather of out of sight is out of mind? To be fair, Cardinal Hollerich was not waving the white flag just yet, as if foreseeing a fait accompli. Despite his pessimistic outlook, he was clear about the cause of the problem and of a possible way out. He argued that, and I quote, at this point, the church must be inspired by a humility that allows us to recognize ourselves better, to be more Christian, because otherwise this culture of Christianity, this only cultural Catholicism, cannot last over time. It has no living force behind it. I think it is a great opportunity for the church. We must understand what is at stake. We must react and put in place new missionary structures. I really think that if you just replace Catholicism in that sentence, most of the clergy, or many of us Christians, might recognize ourselves in what he was saying there, that although it is a challenge, this is still a great opportunity for the church. But Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe, I think, also exists in a milieu of cultural orthodoxy, which often tends to mask what is at stake. In other words, what is relevant. And it masks that behind custom, behind institutional structures, or behind a self-sufficiency which lacks the awareness of humility. Such a context resists new missionary structures. It resists even the idea of it. However, it seems to me that Orthodoxy in the West, although fragmented both geographically and institutionally, is less affected by all of this. I do not fear however, I do fear that the window of opportunity is closing, and that there is insufficient transfer of the experience and ethos of Orthodox diaspora communities to their historic home bases. Now, as I approach the final part of my talk, a few theological considerations and within an ecumenical perspective. Now, the answer to the question, what keeps people coming to church, either virtually or in person, during and after a pandemic? Well, I think the answer to this question is the one that holds the key many church planning committees and commissions are looking for. And one is not allowed to answer that with faith. Yes, it is faith that brings people to church and keeps them coming even during a pandemic. But the question behind that is, what sustains that faith? And the answer may well be the Achilles heel of secularization. I will not venture to disclose that answer to you, not least because I think that it is a very contextual one for each Christian tradition or church. I do think also that there are parts to that answer which we hold commonly across the various Christian churches. And one of that is serving the liturgy, worship and prayer. Grace Davy, whom I've mentioned before, talks about how religious memory mutates in a secular context. And the French sociologist of religion, Daniel Hervieux-Leger, defines religion as a chain of memory. She actually wrote a book with the title, with this title, Religion is a Chain of Memory, and considers secularization as a crisis of collective memory. The COVID pandemic has altered and continues to mutate our shared religious memory. But this is not the first crisis that Christians have faced to the preservation and continuation of religious memory. Speaking somewhat, just thinking about the Orthodox, allow me to recall that no less than 30 years ago, as I said, communism was the pandemic that threatened the chain of religious memory or the chain of faith memory. Communist secularization aimed to impose both physical and spiritual distance between people and their places of worship and between each other. And this was happening before one had the opportunity to stream services online. Yet the church survived, and it did so by serving the liturgy in whatever conditions it had. Serving the liturgy is essential for the preservation of the core of the Christian memory. Our churches continued to do that during this pandemic. And while the memory may have mutated somehow, it has continued. Quite likely, I think, it is actually refreshed. For the Orthodox, it probably is the first postmodern memory we have. I hope I'm not exaggerating, but I really think that in terms of revolutions, this pandemic is one of those moments. So I say again, for the Orthodox, it probably is the first postmodern memory we have. We tend to relive in Orthodoxy pre-modern memories of what worship is or ought to be, for example. I promised not to sound triumphalist at the beginning, and I'm sorry if this does. It is not meant to, but is rather a backhanded compliment. It may be that this pandemic has helped the Orthodox, more so in the diaspora, do something new. Instead of condemning or complaining about postmodernity or about secularization, about its fluid nature, felt even more acutely in the West, they have embraced that fluidity rather than complaining it away. The danger to breaking the chain of memory is greatest from within. It is most acute when the church, faced with the challenge of newness, of pluralism, of otherness, or of secular restrictions, either doubles down on old patterns or embraces change at the cost of continuity. The challenge is not to miss out on what is relevant and thus avoid the danger of becoming irrelevant. This pandemic, with its associated limitations on social, economic, cultural, and religious life, continues to be the test of relevance, or a test of relevance or viability for both the secular and ecclesial society. For the churches, but I would say that especially for the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, it has been and continues to be, not unlike secularization, a test of relevance. The restrictions to religious life brought about by the pandemic have led, especially now in the second wave, to a resurgence of conspiratorial ideas and complaints, of perceived persecution. All of this, I think, concealing the anxiety of losing one's privileged position. The temptation of slipping into ideological apologetics and polarization is very real and seems hard to resist. My hope is that the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe can overcome these challenges and temptations. Our current context is an opportunity not for reasserting external ethno-religious forms of identity and relevance, cultural orthodoxy or cultural Christianity, but for what I would want to call kind of a sacramental revival of our identity, which is sacrificial. And by that I mean the crucified love of the Lord that bridges the distance of otherness, which is kenotic, which focuses on mercy and humility instead of judgment and privilege. And it's also ecumenical, in the sense of taking seriously the sacrament of the brother. These are needed not for the world, not to win over the world, although they impact the world, but they are needed for us to regain ourselves as church, as Christians, so that our witness is common. This brings me literally to my last four paragraphs, my concluding thoughts. I said that the danger of breaking the chain of memory is greatest from within. But this is also valid, I think, in respect to the ecumenical dimension of the universal church. There is this other within, not just within our own churches, but within the ecumenical context. In this context, I submit that the de facto ecumenical co-living that takes place in the West, to various degrees of cooperation and reciprocity, well, this ecumenical co-living that takes place in the West between Orthodox and other Christians, and between sort of non-Orthodox Christians, seems to stand both the test of the pandemic and that of the ongoing secular wearing down of religion in the West. So I want to say, what I want to say now is in relation to the aim of the association, which is, and I'll read, I had to take this from the website. The aim of the association is to advance the Christian religion, particularly by teaching members of the Anglican and Orthodox churches about each other, in order to prepare the way for an ultimate union between them, in accordance with our Lord's Prayer, that all may be one. This aim remains as relevant as ever. It occurs to me that its ethos is deeply woven with the three issues that the title of this lecture intended to address. That is the condition of Christian and religious life and witness in contemporary society in our European context. Some people may look cynically on the apparent lack of progress on that Christian unity that the association and indeed the ecumenical movement as a whole is seeking. I, however, would say that this unity is here already, although it is experienced imperfectly, even as we continue to strive for it. Ecumenical coming together is a marathon, not a sprint, and we have so much to learn about each other. The challenge is twofold, in that there is so much to learn about each of our respective pasts, and to keep up with the constant moving forward happening in each of our churches, albeit at different speeds and not always in the same direction. But all this learning about each other can sound rather poetic and academic and programmatic. Thankfully, the stated aim of the association concludes with the prophetic call for prayer. All its members are urged to work and pray constantly to this end. Indeed, praying together is the best way to learn about each other. It frames godly what otherwise can become a very this-worldly activity, heavy on plans, process, and quantifiable outcomes. At the same time, prayer places our mutual ecumenical learning on the plane of reciprocated intimacy, openness, dependency, and common witness. This unity of prayer, I truly think, is severely undervalued, both within our ecclesial context and outside of it, in what we tend to generally refer to as the secular world. Outside, it is undervalued because its fruits are not readily visible. Hence, prayer is consequently often perceived by the secular mind as no more than religious wishful thinking. Within, I suspect it is undervalued because it is often treated like an overture rather than as the main movement. Nevertheless, ecumenical encounter in prayer is happening, sometimes jointly and openly, many times discreetly. One of its fruits is that it nourishes continual prayer for one another. It is a revelation of both identity and purpose, which encompasses what would otherwise be called the other. Finally, the other corollary of prayer is relevance. I hope I'm not in a minority of one when I say that one of the constant, most immediate realizations brought about by prayer, whether personal or communal, is that of relevance. A sense of I pray, therefore I am, I can, I will, and hopefully we could say, even ecumenically, we pray, therefore we are, we can, we will. Thank you.
Father Dragos, I'm going to hand over to the ACA Treasurer, Father Alan Trigel, who's going to express his thanks on behalf of us all, and then I will explain how questions will take place. Father Alan Trigel. Sorry, trying to unmute you. Give me just one moment. Are you unmuted, Father Alan?
As the treasurer, normally at this stage, it's my responsibility to stand up and ask you all to give me money. But this year, that's not necessary because of the new arrangement, so you can all relax. And instead, I've been given the responsibility of proposing a vote of thanks to Father Dragos for a talk which was both learned, informed by data, but also full of his own personal experiences in the way that he lives out his ministry and his academic thought. Much food for consideration there for all of us. And it was delightful to have your thoughts so neatly tied up with the aim of our association. Now, I don't know if a manner has yet universally been accepted for applauding on Zoom, but I suggest by way of offering our thanks to Father Dragos that we simply clap so that it can be seen on screen.
Let me explain how we're going to do questions, which will be run by the Secretary, Dimitris Salapatas. But just to, what we're going to invite people to do is to write in the chat that they have a question. You don't have to write down the question, just put in the chat that you wish to ask a question, and Dimitri or I will come to you. So just while they're beginning to come in, but just to allow people to write those in, Father Dragos, if I may just ask a very quick opening question while people are writing in their, that they have a question. It's very interesting what you say about, of course, the sort of blueprint for church-state relations of the Byzantine example of the emperor and the church. And I'm just always interested in how the Church of England being an established church with the monarch being the supreme governor, how that looks from an Orthodox perspective in terms of the secularization you've spoken of. Father Dragos.
Yes, thank you. Father Stephen, you're trying to get me into church politics.
Not too much, not too much.
Not too much, no. I have to tread carefully. Well, I think obviously the situation, the context in the Church of England is very specific. Well, I think it's both a blessing and some form of golden cage, and until somebody decides to do something about it, all we can do is moan possibly in a very British way about this thing and this other thing. But I do think that the Church of England has a very in a sense valued and possibly at its very core prophetic mission and how can I put it, direction. This is so difficult. Sorry. I think secretly, everyone who has experienced sort of this meeting between monarchy and church wants to revive that. I think, I mean, even most of the Orthodox, if one would take a poll would probably say that they would want that to be the case. But I would say that to me the Church of England should be more brave in its I don't know, when it's in the voice that it has in public life, even at the, because that is the witness of the church, and I think that it will help, particularly those who are undecided about the role of the Church of England, or who always tend to criticize this. I think it will help attract, I suppose, more people to the church. I don't know how to put it in a different way.
Thank you. Dimitri, I'll let you go from here.
Thank you, Father. Father Dragos, thank you very much for your talk today. It was very inspiring. We normally don't do Q&As after Constantinople Lecture, but we thought we'll try it now with Zoom. We're going to start off with Mustafa. He has a question, so if we can unmute Mustafa and then he can ask his question.
Thank you very much, Father Dragos Herescu. Thank you very much for this beautiful and informative lecture. Do you hear me, by the way?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. My question will be on Romania. I mean, you partly answered it during the lecture, but I'm really still curious to know, like, how do you perceive or interpret the recent restrictions and the partial bans on the pilgrimages in Romania, especially to the one in Iași, Sfânta Parascheva, due to the COVID restriction. And a certain level of tension and contestation occurred between state and the church, Romanian Orthodox Church. How do you think we should interpret this contestation regarding church, state, and secularism in Romania? Thank you very much. Mulțumesc frumos, Părinte.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Right. Well, I think my mind is pretty set on this, and I'm not sure it's possibly the most popular opinion, but I think that the Orthodox Church in Romania could have led from the front in this context, and it didn't. If you were up to me, and I think I put this also in a conversation I had with someone, well, it happened to be on Facebook, because sometimes Facebook is quite a public forum, but I said that the question that the church, when faced with the question of a pilgrimage, should ask is, well, it's twofold. One is, how many people are we willing to accept that will die or will be infected because they came to this pilgrimage? And second question is, how are we able and can we say that we will minimize that as much as we can? I mean, have we run a campaign of awareness? Have we done everything that we could in the wider context so that the pilgrimage itself is placed in a right frame, rather than as a kind of, well, let's go to the pilgrimage to get healed because we're sick or people are sick, and then you end up with the opposite effect. So if these two things didn't occur, then you have a huge problem. And I think they literally didn't occur in Romania. And I think when we speak about humility and kind of what I mentioned about new missionary perspectives, well, I think this is the absolute opportunity to try something new. Like many churches did, particularly here in the UK, around Easter when we were in that full lockdown. I saw more flexibility and more creativity from bishops, Orthodox bishops in the diaspora than there was witnessed in Eastern Europe, for example. There was more trust that was placed on sort of regular Christians to celebrate Easter in their homes. You know, people were encouraged, and this was the first time for Romanians, for example, they were encouraged to make their own epitaphion at home. Okay, and when the priest goes round, as it were, his own living room or whatever with the epitaphion, they were encouraged to do the same with their children around sort of their living room. To me, this was liberating. Okay, rather than complaining that we can't go to church, you offer a solution to people. It's the same with the pilgrimage. And I would say that Saint Paraskeva or Saint Andrew or whatever would not want people to come during a pandemic. I know this sounds almost ceremony, but if we try to think with the mind of the saints, to put it this way, I think we need to say, well, we have a God of responsibility, not of irresponsibility, a God of mercy and love and mutual care, rather than a God of kind of religious idolatry, almost about a place or about an icon and so on. This is when we move the mark into an area that is very problematic. So we have an opportunity, and I think we're not taking it. And this is what alienates people. This is what alienates the younger generation, who tend to read more than just the church daily, for example, and ask different questions. And they tend to be more in tune with what's happening outside of, let's say, Romania or outside of their own country. So this is why I'm saying that the window of opportunity to learn from the experience of the church in the West, the Orthodox Church in diaspora, is closing really fast, because this pandemic will end maybe next year. This time next year, this lecture will be delivered in person. Okay, so once we go back to normal, the impetus to have, to think differently, to try new things, and to adapt will disappear altogether.
Lovely, thank you, Father. Seraphim has also written his question, but I think he, if he would like to say it, ask the question verbally. We will unmute him.
Apologies, you may have to unmute yourself. Apologies, I may have... there we are, thank you.
No? I could read the question.
I'll read it if it is, and then if we'll add anything to it. So in the last 10 years, I have seen a massive increase in Romanians being interested in Halloween. That seems tied into the secular pool of the West and the push by the media, TV, Facebook, YouTube, etc. Is this a separate concern and risk for salvation, or part and parcel of the same issue?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's on the one hand, there is obviously an influence of Western perceived traditions and customs that tend to be associated with, well, if the West does them, then they must be good. There's still this type of a thing in Romania. There's also Romania, or anyway, I suppose Eastern Europe in general. There is also sort of the pressure of advertising and stuff that you can literally buy in shops. Sometimes you go into a shop and you can't avoid Halloween merchandise. It's as simple as that. Your children will say that they want this and that. So yes, there is this. Now, what's behind your question, I suppose, is this question about the secularization of consciousness, as it were. And that is very hard to pin. I mean, if somebody has a Halloween party with their children, but also goes to church on Sunday, why should I wreck their party? I don't know. As a priest, why should I regulate all of these things so tightly? I think there's an organic sort of pull between these things, and I think once you enter with very sort of dogmatic attitudes about these things, the effect is always to the contrary. And I also think that to put it, the church should choose its battles a bit more carefully, because there's lots of stuff that you can criticize about the secular world. If you're going to make a huge thing about Halloween, that's time that you don't spend catechizing people about, I don't know, how to commemorate the saints, or the departed, or other things that you could do. So it's a question of reaching the right balance. But I myself, I'm not. I think this is again part of a polarizing discourse that tends to capture the headlines and a lot of the energy of people, to the detriment of actually addressing the real issues that we have. Yeah, I think there's a lot more that we can focus on that really makes a difference, I think. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you, Father. We have, so Seraphim says thank you for the answer. We have Constantinople Lecture who would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Father Dragos, and it's a pleasure, especially to witness repeatedly Romanian Orthodox thinking, which is a welcome input after so many years of absence, I think. You opened a couple of windows, which I find very optimistic in getting out and learning from this COVID pandemic. You gave statistics about faiths going up and faiths going down in numbers. I wonder if we shift this and we look at it from the point of view, for instance, in England, the languages, people of languages having their faiths going up or going down according to language. For instance, people who speak Arabic, no matter what faith, Hindu, Hebrew, Sanskrit, Sikh, Ethiopian, their numbers are going up. Faiths that are practicing, no matter what faith they are, in English, then their numbers are going down. So this element of belonging, which perhaps English being a secularizing faith, and the Church of England, I think it's a secular faith, the Church of England encourages it. And the second aspect which you fired me up is the collective memory which this COVID pandemic will generate. Thank you so much for bringing this thought process into action. I have seen my parish literally shatter through the pandemic. I filmed our Sunday, it's a Greek Orthodox parish. I filmed one Sunday the meal we were having and just normal activity after liturgy. It was buzzing, it was full of people, children running, old people, all generations, which was a normal Sunday. And I looked at it before coming here. Some people have died, others have gone, others will not be returning. This community, which has existed since, in my case, since 1967, has been virtually shattered. And looking at you and looking at other people here, this collective memory is something which I would like to cherish and to believe what one can recreate, perhaps a rejuvenated parish and Orthodox church here.
Thank you. I've made some notes listening to you. I couldn't grasp a question there, but that's not important. I think I haven't considered it as sort of the language rather than the faith kind of perspective. What I could say about that is that I found English as a language, quite liberating for my own orthodoxy. It took me maybe the better part of a year or maybe 2 years to really tune not my ears but my inner clock, my soul, as it were, so I can feel at home in English while saying prayers or listening to prayers or listening to Lord have mercy rather than Kyrie eleison or Doamne miluiește when we respond to prayers. But now I really just love serving in English. We serve both in English and Romanian in the parish as much as we can. We use English, and no one complained. No, not one person ever told me, "Oh, Father, you just maybe turn it down with the English, or just could you use a little less." No one ever says this. I don't think they do this because they fear me. I'm not a fierce person, but I think it's really just people took on, and I think it's a question of if you lead, people will follow in a sense. And I was walking on fresh snow. I didn't. There were no sort of marks before me, but we do this. So I am very comfortable. I have a very good relationship with English in terms of worship and prayer, and as a language that converts. I think it converts also because I have sometimes understood better prayers that I was saying in Romanian when I said them in English, because the translation felt more clear. I'm probably sure it's the same for people who hear Church Slavonic or Old Greek in their church, and when they listen to a prayer in English, maybe some people might just be appalled because it just doesn't have the same fluidity or melodicity and so on. But I don't have that. So I welcome English as a language, and I would hope that eventually, when in English will become the prevailing language, even for the Orthodox in this country. I mean, without completely shedding one's mother tongue, whatever. But certainly, when you hit the second generation, if you haven't used English for the first generation, you will run into a gulf will have just been there, and you just fall into it once the second generation of children and so on don't have an identity outside of English, for example, even for their prayers. And yes, collective memory with parishes that have been decimated by the pandemic. It is a real problem. It is an issue, but I think that collective memory can be not very easily, but much more easily restored than we think, because it's a question of witness. And we do say in the prayer in the Orthodox Church, in the first prayer the priest reads at the liturgy, that when the words of our Lord, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, well, that's all it takes for people to preserve memory. It's 2 and 3. And then if they do live out their memory authentically, then 2 and 3 will become 20 and 30, and you multiply it. Yeah, the apostles were only 12 or something, to put it crassly in a sense, but yeah.
Lovely, thank you, Father. We have one final question. I think we'll finish off with this, and then Father Stephen Stavry will give his final remarks. So we have Alex who wishes to ask a question.
Alex, can you unmute yourself?
You can always type the question if
Type
it
the
is.
question, we'll ask it for you. I can see you're unmuted, Alex, but we can't hear you, I'm afraid. If you'd like to type the question in the chat. I think we might have to
Move on, maybe.
Well, I can't see it. Thank you. I've just been asked to say the last few words before we conclude, which is that normally at the Constantinople Lecture, we give out copies of our journal, Koinonia. Now, obviously, we're unable to give out copies of it in this form, but I just wanted to show you the edition which is being sent to the printers this week. There we are. There is a copy of this with obviously the very topical image there of Hagia Sophia. Upon which there are several articles. So it's just an encouragement to those of you here this evening, if you're not already, to become members of the association. And you'll receive the journal twice a year. So it will also, however, appear on the website very shortly, so of the AECA, so you'll be able to have a look at it there. I think I should probably just give a final word to Father William Taylor, our chairman, if you have anything you would like to conclude with, Father William.
Just to say, to reiterate the thanks already expressed to Father Dragos for a fascinating lecture. Secularism is the principal issue which faces all churches in the West right now. And the analysis you gave of the effect of the pandemic accelerating secularism by 10 years is something which history will tell us, whether the closure of churches from March onwards has contributed to that. So this is a really important subject, and I'm very grateful to you for addressing it for us in such a wide-ranging way, and we look forward to the publication of the lecture in Koinonia, as Father Stephen said. Thank you to everyone for joining. It's wonderful to see people, and we really do yearn to see you in the flesh. God bless you, and thank you for being here.
Good night.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Father.
Thank you very much to all, and again, Father William and Father Stephen for hosting.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.